Hello, amateurs, and welcome back to another episode of Hot Topics. And I've got Barto with me here today. Barto, how are you?
Yeah, very well. Thanks, Tim. Yourself?
Yeah, very well. Now, with a phenomenal Rugby World Cup finally over, I found some sort of misgivings coming to me about rugby values, and things are just slipping a little bit. And around about the same time, Barto here got in touch with me and also having the same fears. So we're going to dig into some of that today and just kind of see where we're at, I guess. So first of all, Barto, maybe just start off by sort of saying what are the sort of values we're talking about that we feel are slipping away a little bit.
I suppose the biggest one is respect. And right across, that's respect for your teammates, your opposition, the officials, supporters, when you're playing grassroots, the volunteers, just everyone involved in the game. And I feel that the respect that I and yourself grew up with, especially when you're playing the grassroots at school and that, is becoming somewhat diminished. And I particularly think towards officials. And to me, it's a real concern for the sport moving forward.
It is, yeah. I mean, towards officials, I would say is definitely the big one. But I think we saw it in some areas as well that we've never seen it before. And I'm talking about after the final whistle. We saw a couple of incidents where people were riling each other up from a couple of teams. And I think that needs to be cut out of the game as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know there's been some condemnation of England players. It's a bit of a Saracens thing, I suppose, where they celebrate winning a penalty or winning something like that. And but to me, if you're doing it on the pitch during the match, and that's what you want to do, and that keeps you going, and that's all good. But I get what you're saying, Tim, because yes, it was seen, towards the end where you had obviously Willie LaRue against England. And look, I get it. You're passionate. You've just won a huge game, which at 10 minutes before the end, they wouldn't have expected to. And then, likewise, you get Rico Ioane, wishing Johnny Sexton have a great retirement, mate, and sort of sending him on his way. Well, it's one of the greats of the game. Whether, and don't get me wrong, Johnny Sexton dishes it out during the game all the time. And there's a number of referees who said that that's something that he could have curbed throughout his career. But once the whistle's blown for the end of the match, that used to be it. That should be it. And it should be, let's go have a beer, whether that's in the changing rooms or, up in a clubhouse, and move on. And just for the good of the game, that's what you'd love to see come back into it.
Yeah, completely agree with everything you've just said there. But let's stick with the referees, because I think that's possibly the most important one. Now, there was a football game last night, so it's not just our sport either. Chelsea Spurs played last night, and Ange Postecoglou, the Spurs manager, said after the game, because there were a lot of contentious decisions, I understand. He said after the game, at some point, we've just got to accept the referee's decision. And then he went on to elaborate about that's the values that he was brought up with and all that kind of stuff. And basically fearing that, at some point, we're just going to be following the direction of somebody 6 miles away in a shipping container, making decisions on the TV. It rings very true to me. What are your thoughts on that, Barto?
Yeah, Tim, I'm with you. Ultimately, I think there's been too much involvement from those external to the actual pitch, would be my opinion. And referees are trained to an elite level to run elite games, and I think they can do it. I believe there's a position for the TMO when it comes to certain decisions, but I'm wholeheartedly agreeing with the referees. I think need to be supported in them making some of those bigger decisions again, because them being taken away from actually ruling on what's happening on the pitch all the time, or even being overruled, is probably just denting their confidence more than anything. And what we're seeing at the end of the day is there's disputed decisions which are made, whether it's by a referee or a TMO or a bunker. And at the end of the game, the only person who really cops it is the poor old ref. And supporters from teams are just hammering the referee because, let's be honest, some of them are ill-informed and just believe it's the referee who makes the decision. And others are just, well, it doesn't matter, they're the easy one which we can aim our wrath at. So, yeah, to me, referees should be making 95 to 99% of decisions and leave a TMO or a video ref for some critical calls.
Yeah, I agree. I was kind of a fan of TMO coming in when it was first devised, because I thought we'd get some of the bigger decisions right, but I think it's gone far too far now. And I also think it might be a real problem to kind of reverse the process and get rid of it, because it's almost like everybody's got their eyes open now and suddenly everybody's looking for every single decision. And as we know in rugby, things aren't black and white. There's a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of the context of the game that goes into making these decisions. Do you have that same concern?
Yeah, massively. And I think that's one way that the lawmakers can assist, is making laws a lot more black and white. So there's less, subjectiveness in there. And it's a yes or a no. Let's make it really clear. So, that to me, why isn't an assistant referee monitoring the offside line? That shouldn't be a referee's job. It's virtually impossible for a referee when they're within 3 meters of a ruck to see who's behind them or who's even in front of them, where the actual hindmost foot is.
Yeah, 100%. Now, so we talked a little bit about the TMO and that kind of side of things there, but we're also seeing public criticism come from players and coaches. When do you think that kind of started, and why is it such a problem?
Yeah, so look, I believe that Lions talk after the first test, when Rassi came out with his video, was probably the real beginning of it. I understand why he did. When you look back at that game, it wasn't particularly well officiated. Now, sometimes referees have a bad game. Again, human beings, you've got to accept that. But should it be that he publicly leaked a video that then goes out into the domain for everyone to see? And I also have a little bit of sympathy with him, because I do wonder whether he was being listened to by World Rugby and by the refereeing bodies. Because let's be honest, if there's a poor decisions that result in your team losing, which can happen in big series or big matches, then absolutely, as a coach and a management team, you should be able to go and speak to the referees, governing body, and say, look, where are we going wrong? Or we think you went wrong here. We need to improve. So if they weren't actually responding, which is what he led us to believe, he felt that was his only way forward. Whether that's the right way, I doubt it. And I think it's really started a massive snowball effect where now coaches do it. We've got Anton Dupont after matches openly talking about it. The Fijian and Samoan captains talking about unconscious bias. Huge, huge calls to be making, I'm not saying it's not happening, but should they be making them when they're emotional immediately after matches with no real evidence, just a feeling? Because I think that's a massive thing that they've got to look, and that's about respecting the sport. And that's where, okay, take a breath, go away, let's see exactly what there is. Is there some evidence to say it? Let's have discussions and try and, if there is evidence to say there's unconscious bias, then of course you don't want it. You've got to work on that and actually make referees aware and try and make it even for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the big problems about coaches and players openly criticising referees after the games is that it kind of gives the fans an excuse to do it as well, vocally, both on social media and in stadiums. I think if they see players doing it, then it almost validates their own feelings that, yeah, we got cheated, or yeah, the referee was rubbish, or whatever. And I think that's a real problem. I was at the England-South Africa semi-final, and the amount of booing for Ben O'Keefe in the stadium pre-game because of what he'd done the previous week was embarrassing. Like, it was so bad. It was the loudest noise, I think, of almost the entire night, was the booing of the referee before the game. So I think there's a real problem here, and it needs to be resolved as soon as possible. Possibly the greatest referee of all, Wayne Barnes, has just retired, stating that the abuse has got too much, and the amount of things him and his family, most importantly as well, have had to go through is getting to real breaking point. So how do we solve it, Barto? What are the steps that should be taken to sort of get the cat back in the bag, so to speak?
Look, I think it's more than just a rugby issue. It is in rugby now, but I think it's a societal issue, because Wayne Barnes, let's just be clear, he did retire, but he'd always planned to retire after the World Cup, but he definitely mentioned, because obviously, rightly so. And he's been subjected to abuse. In 2007, he received death threats. He had serious death threats where they actually considered whether he would need protection for a period of time after the quarterfinal against France, and he missed a forward pass. He put his hand up and acknowledged that he'd done wrong, but he received death threats. Just recently, Kobus Reinach, the Springbok scrum half, not only officials, but now players are receiving death threats because of what's gone on in matches. And this is where we're talking about respect and respecting just the sport, respecting your opposition players, supporters, the officials. Where do we go with it? How we start it? Well, first of all, the biggest driver, I believe, is the media, is mainstream media, which fuels social media. So if mainstream media, if you pick up a newspaper in New Zealand, if New Zealand have a test match on Saturday, doesn't matter what time of the year it is or who they're playing, on Tuesday or Wednesday, they are talking about who the referee is. And then they talk about how New Zealand have done against that referee in the past. So is it a positive appointment or a negative appointment? Now, I'm picking on New Zealand here because I've spent 12 years living there, and I believe they're particularly bad about referees and not necessarily abusing referees, but making a point of the fact that they have or can have a huge influence on the game, which they can see as a negative influence. Prime example, I have television coverage here of the New Zealand during the World Cup. John Kerwin was asked about what the All Blacks need to do prior, to win their match against South Africa, what they need to control. He said, Wayne Barnes, Wayne Barnes, Wayne Barnes was his response. So you have a legend of the game driving a narrative, okay, that a referee is going to be very responsible for what happens in the game. He didn't say Ian Foster, Sam Cane and his players about how they control the game. That was his response. The build-up to it is just about who the officials are. So I personally believe mainstream media needs to have a serious look at itself about when it comes to all sport. There's lots of other sports with huge issues around this, probably football, bigger issues, but rugby is one that's always been about respect. Journalists coming through now who are rugby journalists, I don't think necessarily value the sport like they used to. They may not have played or in a time where everyone respected the officials, respected their teammates. And then there's that flow onto social media. And it's people who are ill-informed or uninformed who just become a keyboard warrior. Their team loses and they just think, I'm going to blame that person. An example again, after the loss to South Africa, there was a New Zealand Herald Facebook, comment section, and there was a guy slaying Wayne Barnes, absolutely slaying it. And about the time that he allegedly apologised to Ardie Savea to then let him kick 3 points. 90% of New Zealanders still think that's what happened during that game. Whereas their own newspaper afterwards wrote an article to outline that's not what happened. He believed that Ardie Savea had made the tackle, released the player, but didn't make the upward movement away from the player before going back on the ball, which is what the law states. And then he said to Ardie Savea, sorry, I didn't see the replay. Now, you speak to 90% of the New Zealanders, they've taken that because of what was put through the press straight after the game on the commentary during their commentary was he apologised, but then let Andre Pollard kick 3 points. So the media are driving a narrative, and the narrative is let's look at officials to blame, and then it just flows through society.
So we've got simplified the laws a little bit so things can hopefully be a little bit more clear cut. We've got, we're never going to solve mainstream media, unfortunately, until I guess society changes, because that's what sells papers. I think for my part, I would like to see a lessening of TMO interventions. I'd like it to be much more clear cut about when they're allowed to come in and when they aren't, because at the moment it's a bit of a free for all. And for my part, I'm just going to keep using whatever platform I have to push this point and talk about rugby values and encourage everybody, whether it's grassroots on a Saturday or you're watching England at Twickenham, to try and do the same.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing ultimately, Tim, is that we have no game without officials. Now, the stats that you hear, that the officials' numbers coming through are getting less and less, is no surprise, because who wants to go and do a job where they're just going to get abuse? And we've got to remember the most important person on the pitch at whatever level is the referee. it's the officials there. Without them, we have no game. So if we continue to do what we're doing, then in 20 years there will be no game. There will be no rugby because no one will want to be an official. You and I are fortunate enough to know a couple of officials, and they've got thick skin, the majority of them. But what we're seeing now is those younger players or those younger people who may have wanted to pick up a whistle, I would seriously question it. If one of my daughters said to me, "I want to go and referee, rugby," you'd ask them. I'd ask them to seriously consider whether they want to cop a mouthful of abuse from parents, coaches, players moving forward, because the respect is lacking to the everyone involved in the game. And I say that's one of the main values of rugby is respect, and I think we're losing it.
Yeah, completely agree. Okay, people at home, what do you think? This is clearly quite an emotive subject. We'd love to hear from you. Is there anything we've missed? Anything that you think might help that we haven't mentioned today? I'd love to hear it in the comments down below, and give this video a thumbs up while you're down there if you don't mind, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next episode. It just leaves me to say, Barto, thanks very much for your time today.
Cheers, mate. No worries. We'll catch up soon.
Absolutely. And to you at home, get out and play.